I'm on a boat.
Welcome back to Crit and Crit. I am Axion,
And I'm Sint.
and we are continuing our discussion of Pygmalion and our playthrough of Mega Man X.
You just could not get away from the chance to make that reference quickly enough, could you? Sinking my dreams.
The puns, they hurt. So, one of our prior discussions on a previous episode, I don't remember which episode specifically right now, did bring up one of the characters that we have not yet had much of an opportunity to discuss.
And, in our defense, he only shows up, twice, and doesn't have that much impact on the overall plot, so I think we can be forgiven.
Yeah, he's not exactly a major character, but he is an interesting character. Anyway, the character in question is Eliza's father, Arthur Doolittle.
Alfred.
Alfred.
It's okay, though, because you see, when he shows up, he's the type of character who will do little.
So, to provide a little bit of context, Mr. Doolittle shows up twice in the story. The first time he shows up is very shortly after Eliza has been more properly introduced to Higgins and Pickering, and arranged for the beginning of Higgins' education. But the first thing he's done with her is told her to go get cleaned up, be properly presentable, and to his housekeeper, Mrs. Pierce, has told her to burn all of Eliza's clothes. Eliza is ushered out of the room after sending a message to the waiting cab driver outside to go on with his day, and taken out with Mrs. Pierce, and the gentlemen are left by themselves. And Mr. Doolittle arrives a short-ish time later.
Yep. Mr. Doolittle is what he calls, what he has been called by others and adopted the term for himself, the undeserving poor. That's what I am. Think of what that means to a man. It means he's up against the middle-class morality all the time. If there's anything going and I put in for a bit of it, it's always the same story. You're undeserving, so you can't have it. But my needs is as great as the most deserving widows that ever got money out of 6 different charities in 1 week for the death of the same husband. I don't need less than a deserving man, I need more. Which can probably dovetail very nicely with the description that Shaw gives us when Mr. Doolittle first enters. Alfred Doolittle is an elderly but vigorous dustman, clad in the costume of his profession, including a hat with a back brim covering his neck and shoulders. He has well-marked and rather interesting features, and seems equally free from fear and conscience. He has a remarkably expressive voice, the result of a habit of giving vent to his feelings without reserve. His present pose is that of wounded honor and stern resolution.
This is a man who, for the most part, does not seem to have the time nor inclination to follow the general niceties of society, and his excuse for such usually is, I'm too poor, I have better things to focus on.
I mean, word for word. Have you no morals, man? Can't afford 'em, Governor. Neither could you if you was as poor as me.
This is, interestingly, a rather stark contrast with Eliza, who's not that much better off at this point in the story than her father is. She makes quite a revelation when his presence is introduced to her, that her father is something of a ne'er-do-well, and that while he technically has a trade of his own, his primary occupation is the acquiring of money from other people.
Yeah, or as she puts it, talking money out of other people's pockets into his own is his trade. His proper trade's a navvy, and he works in it sometimes too, for exercise. yes, Doolittle shows up having heard when Eliza has sent for some luggage sent from her home, which, well, does not include any clothing. And, well, what was I to think from that, Governor? I ask you as a parent, what was I to think? So, he starts off with the appearance of some degree of morals, despite what he says about a page and a half later. But Higgins quickly calls him on this. Clearly, you're here to take her home. And Doolittle begins to protest.
He's not particularly interested in having her back home, and he is particularly interested in making some kind of deal with Higgins and Pickering. Namely, he wants £5.
Yeah, or, as his nice little eloquent speech goes, I ask you as two gentlemen not to play that game on me. I'm playing straight with you. I ain't pretended to be deserving. I'm undeserving, and I mean to go on being undeserving. I like it, and that's the truth. Will you take advantage of a man's nature to do him out of the price of his own daughter what he's brought up and fed and clothed by the sweat of his brow till she's grown big enough to be interesting to you two gentlemen? Is £5 unreasonable? I put it to you, and I leave it to you. And Higgins has a very interesting reaction to this. Pickering, if we were to take this man in hand for 3 months, he could choose between a seat in the cabinet and a popular pulpit in Wales.
To which, yeah, he is not at all interested.
Yep. Not me, Governor, thank you kindly. I've heard all the preachers and prime ministers. It's a dog's life any way you look at it. Undeserving poverty is my line. And then he insists, only a $5. It'll all be spent by Monday. Be like, I never gave it to me. What about £10? Nope, wouldn't know what to do with it. So he literally just wants, like, enough money to amuse himself for the weekend. For, you know, the, what's effectively the sale of his only child.
Yep. And he's pretty shameless about it. And when Eliza calls him on his nonsense when she shows up a short time later, at which point, Doolittle does not recognize her. Because she's been cleaned up and dressed up by Mrs. Pierce, she is completely unrecognized by her own father.
Which is actually something interesting, more on just social class at that point, because we didn't really discuss the scene with Eliza following the instructions to get clean. She has never actually fully undressed in her entire life. Bathing was not something that was really something she was in a position to afford, and she spends that entire scene terrified and just shrieking because she doesn't want this to happen. She's scared. It's not usual to her. So yeah, it's honestly probably not that far-fetched for someone who's known her well her entire life to not recognize her without the protective layer of dirt.
So Eliza shows up, is quite blunt about how she feels about her father and his current situation, and he takes his £5 and heads on his way. And
Well, which is even funnier because, Doolittle, you brought your daughter up too strictly. Me, I never brought her up at all, except to give her a lick of strap now and again. Don't you put it on me, Governor. So after he makes a speech about my rights as a parent, he just basically says he hasn't actually raised her at all. She's just kind of there. And I honestly find the whole rights as a parent spiel very interesting because I've only ever encountered it in one other literary character that I can remember. And that would be Pap Finn in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, who is also a ne'er-do-well parent who is basically absent from their child's life until they think they can make a quick buck. And then they quickly show up to claim, quote, their rights for doing all the trouble of raising their kid. So, you know, that's a fun comparison to welcome.
Yep. I admittedly have not read Huck Finn in forever, so I will have to review that if we ever want to take a crack at that particular text somewhere down the line.
Yeah, we'll see.
So anyway, this is the last we see of Mr. Doolittle for several scenes before he shows up near the end of the play. At this point, Eliza has done her demonstration at the big fancy noble party. She's been mistaken for a royal woman by Higgins' former student. And the gentlemen have considered their bet won. Eliza has fully justifiably thrown the book or the shoe at Higgins and left, and has relocated to Mrs. Higgins' house, where she has received some much-needed solidarity, which we'll get into that later. And Higgins and Pickering have come looking for her, and then, out of nowhere, Mr. Doolittle shows back up.
Yep. And now this bears some more context that we kind of skipped over in the last scene. After Doolittle leaves, Higgins makes a joke that basically, I'm going to write to a philosopher friend of mine about this man because this is hysterical for reasons that are only hysterical to Higgins. Evidently, he does go ahead and write this letter because when we next see Mr. Doolittle, he's looking quite well off and very, very irate about it.
Yep, he shows up in fancy dress. Almost as fancy as Higgins himself. And he accosts Higgins, more or less, and accuses this of being all his fault because Higgins contacted a friend of his in America to basically rave about the unique style and ideas of Mr. Doolittle's personal morality, and this American person was so impressed by what Higgins told him that when he died a few short months later, he left his entire will and personal wealth to Mr. Doolittle, on the condition that a few times a year he will lecture in various places about his personal morality.
Yep. Or, it's like, what has my son done to you, Mr. Doolittle? Done to me, ruined me, destroyed my happiness, tied me up and delivered me into the hands of middle-class morality. You're drunk, you're mad, I gave you £5. After that, I had 2 conversations with you, £0.50 an hour, I've never seen you since. Then Doolittle clarifies about what we've just talked about with you wrote the letter, he left me £3,000 a year, and basically his complaint is, well, now everybody's coming to me for money. Now I'm expected to provide for everybody. I didn't want to provide for anybody. I was happy just doing as I was, and now I have relations coming out of the woodwork, just getting some money here and there, and my girl actually wants to marry me now, and that is the worst of all things. # boomer humor.
So, in the course of a few months, this man has gone through a radical shift in his lifestyle and is, unlike most people that you would think would be ecstatic about suddenly being quite wealthy after a lifetime of poverty, he is very upset because now there are expectations.
Yeah, but he obviously has not had the same education that Eliza has, so he's going to be really out of place even amongst this new group, just because, well, I like this. They've got you every way you turn. It's a choice between the skilly of the workhouse and the Charybdis of the middle class. Exactly as written, which is obviously meant to be Scylla and Charybdis of the Odyssey. Which I'm wondering where he saw the term, because he sure does not know how to say it.
Which probably means he's literate, so he read it, but he has no idea how it's properly pronounced.
Which is interesting because literacy was so hit or miss back then, but I could possibly see him having to learn to read a little bit as also part of the condition of this will and this income that he has had so reluctantly thrust upon him.
Yep. He's an interesting character in how he contrasts between his position as the undeserving poor and his personal moralities compared with that of his own daughter, who, despite being in a similar financial situation, is herself fairly moral and respectable and has a decent understanding of right and wrong, and for all of her frustrations with everything that happens to her, does not seem to be a bad person or take advantage of anybody in any way. She's a hard worker.
And
go ahead.
I was just going to say that, like, this kind of tracks pretty well with what we see of Doolittle in the musical, where he has a couple of the really fun, upbeat comic relief songs with a little bit of luck and Get Me to the Church on Time, where, like, he doesn't really come across as any sort of role model whatsoever. He's just... You know how nowadays people say, we're here for a good time, not for a long time?
Yeah, I've heard that.
That's Mr. Doolittle.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Except he's actually managed to be here for a fairly long time. So, I mean, it seems to be working out for him.
Yep, even at the end. Any closing remarks?
Father of the Year? Granted, the year is probably like 2020 or 2021, so, I mean, if you're going to win Father of the Year, it's going to be in one of those years.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. Anyway, I think that wraps it up for today. We will continue our discussion of Pygmalion in our next episode. Thank you, ladies.
Bye!
Thank you, and see you next time.